Today we're joined by Professor Joseph Nye, University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He previously served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Chair of the National Intelligence Council, and Deputy Undersecretary of State for Security Assistance, Science, and Technology. He was ranked as one of the most influential scholars on American foreign policy in a recent survey of international relations scholars. And in 2011, Foreign Policy named him one of the top 100 global thinkers. He's also the author of the new book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents in Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump. Professor Nye, thank you for joining us today. The Pacific War still affects geopolitics today. And sort of the big points about it, the legacy of the war and why it still matters.
One of the things that I find interesting about the end of World War II in the Pacific is to contrast it with Asia. To contrast Asia with Europe, in the sense that in Europe, you had a situation where France and Germany reconciled. And in Asia, Japan and China have never really reconciled. And the net effect was it led to a Cold War in Asia, which looks somewhat different from the Cold War in Europe. What you have in Europe was an Atlantic alliance. What you have in Asia, of course, was hub and spokes, with the US anchored in Japan and Korea, and briefly tried to set up a Seato, but it never really came to that much. So it's fascinating to me to contrast the patterns of these two countries, two regions, and the net effect of that is it's left a situation today which is strongly shaped by the way the World War II ended. Look at the two great hotspots we see now of the Korean Peninsula, which is a result of dividing Korea between Russia, a late entrance into the war, and the United States. Look also at the situation of Taiwan, where the hostility between the US and China, which grew as the Americans tried to unify Korea, and China entered, crossed the Yalu and entered the Korean Peninsula. That led to the end of any efforts of rapprochement with China over Taiwan. So hotspots today in the region still reflect the situation at the end of World War II. One of the big changes, of course, more recently has been the rise of China and the increase of Chinese power, now the second largest national economy in the world, displacing Japan, which used to be second largest. And it also is obviously raised a number of questions about great power rivalry in the United States. We saw some of this when I was in the Clinton administration in the Defense Department, and we developed the strategy, which was to say that if there are going to be three major powers in the region, the US, Japan, and China, balance of power 101 tells you it's better to be part of the two than the one. And that led to the so-called Nye Initiative, in which we reaffirmed the US-Japan Security Treaty, which was somewhat on the ropes in '92. And President Clinton and Prime Minister Hashimoto in '96 reaffirmed that the US-Japan Security Treaty was going to be the basis for stability of the post-Cold War world. And it has, to that sense, remained the bedrock of American position there. The key question now, I think, is looking ahead, is how do we avoid this becoming a new Cold War in Asia? People are talking about that in Washington all the time. I think it's a misleading metaphor. What you see is much more traditional international politics rather than a new Cold War. There's a much higher degree of economic and social interdependence between the US and China. And in addition to that, you find that there's some issues where we're going to be have to cooperate with China just out of necessity to solve the problems. Climate change is one, the pandemics are another. And the question then is, can America learn to follow two objectives at the same time? Can we learn to have a deterrence, a balance of power against China in areas where we have to worry about power over others, but can we also learn to work with them simultaneously on areas where we can only have power with others, such as the new ecological imperatives I mentioned? And that's going to be the great question. China is not 10 feet tall. We can handle the first of those. Question is whether we can do both simultaneously. As Lyndon Johnson once put it, can Americans learn to walk and chew gum at the same time? I think we can, though sometimes I wonder about it. But anyway, those are the problems which I think persist from that the way the World War II ended in Asia. And it's interesting to see how they persist to this day and what the challenges for us are now as we try to deal with them.
It's a wonderful introduction. Thank you for that. There was a comment by the official who at one point ran the Policy Planning Bureau at the State Department, who was talking about great power competition and said that China, it represents a new kind of competitor that we hadn't met before because they're not Caucasian, to which I work with Ambassador State Roy, who, as I'm sure you know, grew up in China under Japanese occupation, which, so when I told him what he'd said, he said, well, I don't, and who was that shelling my house? And so the questions of metaphors, I think, is very important, and making sure we learn the right lessons from history. I'm glad that you raised this idea that people are talking about a new Cold War. Secretary Pompeo, just a few days ago, gave a speech about China. And I wanted to read a few sentences of his speech for you to react to in the context of learning the right lessons or the wrong lessons from history. He said that, and I'm quoting now, Marxism-Leninism is this ideology that informs Xi Jinping's decades-long desire for global hegemony of Chinese communism. America can no longer ignore the fundamental political and ideological differences between our countries, just as the Chinese Communist Party has never ignored them. So clearly there are ideological differences between the Chinese system and the American system, but this language is very reminiscent of the language that people would use occasionally during the actual Cold War. So I'm curious if you think that this is the wrong frame, what is the right frame?
Well, I tend to call the relationship a cooperative rivalry. And it goes back to the fact that you have an extraordinary degree of interdependence between the US and China, which there never was between the US and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. We had almost no trade with the Soviets. We have, if you listen to the president, too much trade with China now. If you look at students, we had almost no Soviet students in the United States. We have something like 370,000 Chinese students in the US. In addition to that type of social and economic interdependence, there is the new ecological interdependence, which is driven by the laws of physics and biology, and which are not going to go away no matter what policy says. So in that sense, it's a very different situation. You once asked me, Abe, about how would a policy planner in 1930 have looked ahead to 1940? How would a policy planner today look ahead to the agenda of international politics in 2030? And one of the things I'm sure will be a much higher issue on the agenda is climate change. And I fear also pandemics. This COVID episode is not the last nor the worst of the epidemics we may see. So in that sense, this ability to plan for a rivalry which will be a real rivalry. And at the same time, realize there's some areas where we'll have to work together to keep a stable world economy, to deal with things like climate change and pandemics. That's going to be a tougher policy problem than simple deterrence was during the Cold War.
One of the concerns that some folks raise when discussing cooperation with China, and I'm sure it's a dynamic you've experienced in your work, has been China's tendency to try to link issues, in that if you want cooperation with them on one issue, they expect you to hold back on other issues that they find to be more sensitive, whether that's arms sales to Taiwan or freedom of navigation operations, the sort of things that China doesn't like that we do, which some people think is important for the United States to continue as an expression of our interest beyond just the PRC. So how do you think about balancing and managing that tendency from the Chinese, if we are going to be able to effectively cooperate with them, but at the same time continue to compete and balance with them outside of the bilateral relationship?
Well, we've got to maintain our capacity not just to cooperate, but also to compete. And that means competition not just in the terms of military deterrence, which we're seeing, for example, with our freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. We're not going to roll over and accept China's behavior about pouring sand on a rock or atoll and calling it an island, and we shouldn't. That's going to be tough. At the same time, we're going to have to get strong economically. We're going to have to make sure that on certain keystone technologies, such as issues relating to 5G, that we do say no Huawei. There are areas where we're going to have to decouple and be tough. And we're going to therefore have to be able to take it to the Chinese when they say you can't criticize Xinjiang or you won't have your Huawei connection. No, we're going to have to make sure that we don't get in that situation. The danger I see is that we focus only on that and don't focus enough on the other part of it, which is there are areas where we say to the Chinese, look, it's in your interest to make sure that the internet works, or else you're going to be deconnected. It's in your interest to make sure that Himalayan glaciers don't melt, or you're going to be flooded and then have a drought after it. It's in your interest that we work together to both deal with pandemics more efficiently and honestly than we've done with this one. So we're not going to appeal, and if the Chinese say, well, then don't say anything about Hong Kong, say, no, sorry, we're doing this because of your interests. And if they don't have leverage over us because we've been effective in the competitive side, then essentially they're going to have to cooperate because it's in their interest.
Very good. Wondering if we could turn the discussion a bit towards Japan. And thinking about the history, as somebody who's worked on the alliance with Japan, as you have, it's always struck me about how remarkably close the relationship is and how much we actually can do to each other, considering the history of this relationship, going back to 1945. And you mentioned in your opening comments the Nye initiative that you pressed during the Clinton administration when the alliance was on the ropes. And now we see the alliances on the ropes again through a lot of the decisions that the Trump administration has been pressing as it relates to trade and to host nation support. Do you believe that we need maybe a Nye initiative part 2 or some form of effort to try to revitalize not only our relationship with Japan, but more broadly across the region?
Well, I think we need to rethink the structure of the alliance. Rich Armitage and I have held several bipartisan reports over the last 2 decades to make sure that we think about the U.S.-Japan alliance as a firm bedrock. And one of the things we've suggested is finding a new structure for basing. In other words, have more American forces based at Japanese bases. The flag that flies will be Japanese, but some of the forces that will be there will be American forces. We have this in some places like Misawa Air Base now, but we could do this much more broadly. And there are other things like that that we can talk about. That's very different in terms of thinking about the future of the alliance and the structure of the alliance than the current administration's demands for changing host nation support, where Japan actually pays about 3/4 of the costs of our having troops there. So I'd rather see a effective working long run plan of how you get to that idea of a difference in the structuring of bases than something that's too dramatic, which may imply that the alliance is not healthy right now. Frankly, I think it's survived the oddities and vicissitudes of the current administration much better than one could have expected.
A professor friend of mine a few months ago remarked that there's going to be several dissertations written about the resilience of alliances because they've shown themselves to be much more resilient than I think some expected over the last few years, which I think is interesting. There was I've been reading, getting ready for this anniversary, I've been reading about Japanese thinking, Japanese writing in the 1930s and early 1940s about attacking the United States, about their war plans. And one of the interesting dynamics of that, to me, was the sense that many of them had in the Japanese military was that they didn't think they could actually win. They thought that victory was unlikely, but it was better than the certain defeat of crushing their economy under the sanctions that had been put against them. So they decided to roll the dice, which I think has some interesting statements about deterrence by denial, which is how a lot of people think about deterrence with China. As their military modernizes and improves. But one of the key differences that we have then that I'm writing about for this initiative now is our alliances. That we certainly had some bases in Asia in the 1940s, but not the kind of robust relationships and posture that we have now, which makes things very different from us. So, one of the questions I asked in one of the other interviews that we asked, and I think it's a nice way to sum these things up. We talk a lot about what the United States should learn from this history, about deterrence, about engagement, about institutions, and there's certainly a lot to learn from that. But curious if we could maybe turn things around a bit. If you were talking to a Chinese audience, speaking with some Chinese officials or Chinese scholars, and thinking about what the Chinese should learn from the Pacific War and how things turned out for Japan, for the United States. I'm curious how you would respond to that, what you think the Chinese need to learn about this, not just the Americans.
Well, somebody jokingly put it, reversing, I guess it was Napoleon's favorite phrase or famous phrase, don't waken a sleeping giant. The Japanese essentially thought that they had no choice but to attack at Pearl Harbor, even though Admiral Yamamoto, as you said, knew that it was not a winning proposition. They felt that they had to attack to avoid strangulation. And the Americans, at that point in their isolationism, were a sleeping giant. The Japanese awakened us, and it proved to be a huge mistake. Yamamoto, of course, lost his own life at Midway. So in that sense, I would say to the Chinese, study this history carefully and look at what happened when you awaken the sleeping giant. If you take too much advantage of the United States, and if you take a risk, you may find yourself regretting the consequences. Similarly, when Chinese sometimes asked me when I was in the government, would we defend Taiwan? And I said, I don't know the answer, and you don't know the answer, because in 1950, Secretary of State Atchison said it was outside our defense perimeter, and within 6 months we were at war there. So don't take the risks. If you get into a situation where you think you're going to be able to manage the risk, you probably won't. And as I try to spell out in this new book I've done on Do Morals Matter, Presidents and Foreign Policy since 45, the important thing is to be prudent in the management of risk. And that, I think, is the crucial message I would want to give them.
Thank you. Thank you very much for talking with us, Professor Nye. Very interesting, very helpful, and we very much appreciate your thoughts.
Well, the pleasure is mine.